Hello all, welcome to Quantifiers. So we are starting with our RC99 series. So in this video, we will going to look at the very first passage of a very well-known book, RC99 by Aristotle. So this book is an excellent source for any management aspirant, primarily made by American publications for GMAT students. But I strongly recommend to CAT aspirants also to solve this particular book because it will going to give you good insights into the RC passages, the kind of the questions. They are somewhat similar to what CAT actually tests you upon. So without delay, let's see what this passage is all about. So this is the very first passage of the book. Let me just get into this. Yeah, so passage one. What I recommend to my students every time is the note making technique in case if you believe that you are an average when it comes to understanding whatever is written in the text and you get zoned out. So my suggestion is to just write down, just scribble down whatever the doodles or the notes or anything that you want to say from a particular paragraph. So we're going to do and apply that particular strategy for this passage also. So once surrounded and protected by vast wilderness, many of the national parks are adversely affected by the activities outside their boundaries. So it's very clear from the very first line of the passage that, very first line of the para, that what is the passage is kind of telling us. So once surrounded and protected by vast wilderness, many of the national parks, so suppose this is a national park, are adversely affected by the activities which is outside their boundaries. So they're affected by the activities outside their boundaries. Now, the National Park Organic Act established the national park system and empowered the Secretary of the Interior to manage activities within the parks. Conditions outside park boundaries are not subject to regulation by the Park Service unless they involve the direct use of park resources. Now, this is since it's an American publication, so we need to understand a little bit terminologies here. So, the secretary here is, you can say, the kind of the governments, okay, the central governments maybe for that matter. So the National Park Organic Act established the national park system and empowered the Secretary of the Interior to manage the activities within the park. That is, who is ruling the activities or who is governing the activities inside the park? That is the central government. In case if we call it in our language, right? In terms of the Indian context. Now, conditions outside park boundaries are not subject to regulation by the Park Service. So I hope now you get what is the idea of this para. So this para is actually telling us that many of the national parks are adversely affected by activities outside their boundaries. Now, why they're adversely affected by the activities outside their boundaries? Because the inner part, the interior part of the national park, within the national park system, it is empowered by the secretary to manage the interior activities, but outside it is not subject to the regulation by the secretary. Okay, so that is the case. Now, so in case overall, in case if I have to summarize the para number one, then I would say that it basically describes the problems facing the national parks, okay, especially from the activities surrounding them, okay, from the outside their boundaries, okay. Now, several approaches to protecting the national parks from external degradation. Let me just drag it, okay. I have to drag it here. Yes. So several approaches to protecting the national parks from external degradation have been proposed, such as one focusing on enacting federal legislation. Now, the federal legislation is a central government legislation. So what they're saying is that to protect the national parks from outside or external degradation, so one proposed fact or one proposed act is that you give the power to the federal legislation. Now, the federal legislation is basically the central government granting the National Park Service border powers over lands adjacent to the national park. So it is what they're saying, that one such advice is that the national park within is maintained by the central government. So one such proposal is that the land which is outside this particular national park should also be given to the federal legislation so that they can have the powers over the lands adjacent to the national parks. Now, legislation addressing external threats to the national park twice passed the House of Representatives. Okay. Now, House of Representatives, basically, you can say the Lok Sabha. Okay. And but died without the action in the Senate. And the Senate, in case of the Indian context, in case if you need to understand, so that is Rajya Sabha. Okay. So what happened, that legislation addressing external threats to the national park twice passed the Lok Sabha, but they died because the Rajya Sabha was not supporting, something like that. Okay. So also brought to the tables as possibly remedies giving the states bordering the parks a significant and meaningful role in developing federal park management policy. So very simple, okay, provided in case if you know about these particular terminology. So in case if you understand what the House of Representatives and the Senate did, but that is the beauty, when you read Diversify, you are getting accustomed to the kind of the languages that are used. So what is the second paragraph is saying? So you know that the first paragraph was basically addressing the issue that the national parks is maintained, the interior of the national park is maintained by the central government, but there are a lot of disturbances from the outside areas, okay? And now the question is, who's gonna basically govern this outside activity? So one proposal is that you give the stake to the central government only. So they are maintaining within the park, so they'll maintain outside the park. But then they are passing the particular they are passing this particular thing, but it is getting note from the House of Representatives, but it is dying every time with the Senate, okay? So possible remedy, what they are saying is that, okay, in case of not central government, then the state government who is bordering the particular parts, they play a meaningful role, okay? Now let's see. So I hope now you understand what is the connect between the para 1 and para 2. So para 2 basically describes approaches to dealing with the problem. The one is federal legislation, which actually failed. So giving the states the rights or asking the states to play a significant and meaningful role in developing that. Now let's get into the third paragraph of the passage. Let me just clear the drawings. Yeah. Okay, so third paragraph, what the third paragraph is saying. So because the livelihood of many citizens is linked to the management of national parks, local politicians often encourage state involvement in federal planning. Very simple, okay? So there are a lot of people who have their livelihoods based on the management of the national parks. So it makes sense to encourage state involvement in federal planning. But wherever there is a contrast word, so that means that the author is getting into the picture, and that is a red flag for you. So, but state legislatures have not always addressed the fundamental policy issues of whether states should protect park wildlife, okay? But what is the problem? So they are saying, okay, give it to the state. But then there is an issue raised by the author that state legislatures have not always addressed the fundamental. So they have not always addressed the fundamental policy issues of whether states should protect wildlife, okay? So they are not in supporting. So they should protect or not. They have not given this. They have not addressed this issue. So it's okay. You give it to the state, but the states are not ready to take the responsibility, okay? Ideally, this was the next paragraph. So timber harvesting, ranching. So ranching is, you can say, kind of grazing your animals, kind of an animal husbandry, raising and grazing livestock, especially the cattle, the sheep, etc. So timber harvesting, ranching, and energy exploration compete with wildlife within the local ecosystem. So what are the problems? So they say, they are affected by the activities outside their boundaries. So what are those activities? Timber harvesting, ranching, and energy exploration compete with wildlife with the local ecosystem. Priorities among different land uses are not generally established by the current legislation. Additionally, often no mechanism exists to coordinate planning by the state environmental regulatory agencies. These factors limit the impact of legislation aimed at protecting park wildlife and the larger park ecosystem, right? So basically, you can say that this particular, prior to this paragraph was saying that give power to states to cooperate with adjacent national parks, okay? But then they say that there is a problem with the state thing, okay? So there are a lot of timber harvesting, ranching, and energy exploration. They compete, okay? And priorities among different land users are not established, okay? Additionally, often no mechanisms exist to coordinate planning by the state environmental regulatory agencies, okay? So what they argue is that the state participation must be tied to the federal regulation. So that is missing. These factors limit the impact of legislation aimed at protecting park wildlife and larger park ecosystem. So basically what they're saying is that you give authorities to the state, but there are a lot of problems when you give authorities to the state. The one is that the state is not ready to take the responsibility. Okay, they have not played a significant role so they often encourage this thing, but again, the state have not always addressed the fundamental policy issues. Then secondly, there is no mechanism exists which coordinate the planning by the state environmental regulatory agencies. So let's see what is the next paragraph talking about. So even if these deficiencies can be overcome, state participation must be consistent with existing federal legislation. So they are saying that it argues that the state participation must be tied to federal regulations. State lacks jurisdiction within national parks themselves, and therefore state solutions cannot reach activities inside the parks, thus limiting state action to the land adjacent to the national parks. This is what we have read. So under the supremacy clause, federal laws and regulation supersede state action if state laws conflicts with federal legislation. If Congress recludes local regulation, or if federal regulation is so pervasive, then no room remains for state control. Assuming that federal regulations leave open the possibility of state control, state participation in policy making must be harmonized with existing federal legislation. Okay. So here, first of all, we need to understand the Congress, in case of the American, the Congress word is actually used for the parliament. Okay. Now, what is they are saying is that, okay, there are a lot of problems with the state. Okay. But they still say that in case if all the deficiencies can be overcome, and the state is allowed to look after the external factor also. But then what they are saying is that the internal is being controlled by the federal government, which is the central government. Okay. So in case if there is any kind of the conflict, still the thing that will gonna rule or the supersede will be the federal laws. Okay. So federal laws and regulations supersede state action if state laws conflicts with federal legislation. Okay. So assuming that the federal regulations leave open the possibility of the state control, so in case if still the federal government gives, okay, you look after the area outside the national park, then also the one thing that is mandatory is the state participation in policy making must be harmonized. It should be in sync with the federal regulations. So now the residents of the states bordering national parks are affected by park management policies. They in turn affect the success of those policies. This interrelationship must be considered in responding to the external threats problem. Local participation is necessary in deciding how to protect park wildlife. Local interests should not, however, dictate national policy, nor should they be used as a pretext to ignore the threats to the park regions. Okay. Now, the author has brought one more dimension to this particular passage. He says that it requires a national response to maintain or to go look for the park management policies. Okay. So they need to require a national response by including the local participation also. Okay. So they are saying that the local participation is also necessary in deciding how to protect park wildlife. So whether you are giving the outside thing to the federal government or to the state government, the node or the yes or the local participation is also vital in that case. Okay. So overall, an easy paragraph to be comprehended, not very difficult words, easily written. Let's just do a quick recap of whatever we have done, basically, whatever is being written. So the first paragraph basically talks about that the national park, the internal part is being managed by the central government, but there are the problems that will gonna manage the outside boundaries. Then the author say that the ones such as you give to the central government, but then they say that it does not, this, the House of Representatives, okay, but it died without Senate. So let's give to the state government. But then the author says that there are a lot of problems with the state government also. And then third says, okay, in case if everything is resolved also, and in case if we give state government the authority to handle the outside area, then again, it needs to be in sync with the harmonized with the existing federal legislation. Otherwise, there will be no point. Okay. And at last, the author says that the local participation also plays a vital role. So overall, in case if I have to give the main idea of the passage, then the author basically discusses approaches to dealing with the problem of, you can say, the negative effects of the surrounding land to the national parks. Okay. So without wasting much time, let's get into the questions directly and see in case if we were able to solve it. So I hope that before watching this particular video, you guys have solved this particular passage. Okay, that makes more sense. Now, what is the main purpose of the author in writing the passage? So it's a global and a big picture question. So main purpose is your main idea, central idea, main theme, primary purpose, why the author has written the passage. So you know that the why the author has written the passage is basically, if you have mapped the passage correctly, you notice that most of the passage discusses the different approaches that can be taken to solve the problem of activities or the degradation because of the activities which is happening outside the boundaries. Okay. So let's see the one by one. So argue that rampant timber harvesting is degrading national parks. So was that the national idea? Okay, no doubt that this was mentioned in the passage. Okay, but it is, so you remember that in our classes we have done Bain approach for the main idea question. So you reject any option that is very broad, you reject any option which is alien, reject any option which is narrow, and reject any option which is extreme. So this is very, very, very narrower. Okay, it was just here, it was being mentioned of timber harvesting. So it was just given as one of the example that of the activities that are affecting the national parks outside their boundaries. Okay, so that is not the main idea. Okay, so it is too specific as a choice for a main purpose question. The passage does more than this. Okay, it tells us about that state government should be allowed, it should be in sync with the existing federal legislation, the local participation. So it cannot be the answer. Okay, describe a plan of action to resolve an issue. Now, okay, we're going to keep it on a hold and discuss about it. Discuss different approaches to dealing with the problem. Again, on a hold, we're going to consider these two. Let's first of all negate option number D and E. So suggest that local participation is necessary to solve the problem described. So local participation was just mentioned here. Okay, it is very too specific. It is again very narrower to be the answer. This is not the main purpose. Now, main purpose is something which is present in the passage from the beginning till the end. Each and every paragraph of the passage basically contributes towards that main purpose or the main idea. Okay, so this is again narrower, hence cannot be your answer. Now, to assert that national parks are adversely affected by activities outside their boundaries. Okay. Now, okay, so let's see again with this particular option. Okay, this can be one of the case you may advocate that why not this can be the answer because it is very case. Okay, but again, this is just I would say just related to the para one of the passage. Okay, the passage generally starts with this line. Okay, so it might lead some of you to believe that this is the main passage. So first of all, we need to break this notion that anything that is very first line of the passage is not necessarily the main idea. He might just put that particular thing to introduce you to the topics that we're going to discuss later in the passage. So again, remember I told you that the main idea is something which is present in the passage from the beginning till the end, and each and every paragraph contributes towards it. Okay, so however, in case if you read further this particular passage, no, it becomes clear that the scope of the passage is broader. Okay, it is not just discussing that, okay, this is the problem. Okay, so this is option is saying that to assert that national parks are adversely affected by the activities outside their boundaries, but the main purpose is not to tell you that the national parks are being affected. The author is also giving you the solutions or the different approaches to solve this particular problem. So since it misses upon the approaches part, hence it cannot be the main purpose. Now let's see, describe a plan of action to resolve an issue or discuss different approaches to dealing with the problem. Now with the cat, it always gives you problem with the two close options. Generally what I say every time is that the cat game starts when you're left with the two closed options. Okay, it does not start when you're able to eliminate the two options out of the closed options. So that is not a case. Okay, now here a little bit of the grammar will gonna come into the picture. Okay, it is saying describe a plan of action. So a plan of action basically means that there is only one plan of action, but the author is not suggesting any one plan of the action. Rather, he's telling us the different ones. Okay, so one such plan of the action, he say, okay, then give it to the federal government. Okay, then he say that the Senate is not allowing it to pass. Okay, then he says that, okay, the second approach could be to give it to the state government. Then he says, okay, with the state government also there is a problem. And thirdly, while coming up with the approach, we also need to look at the local participation. So there are a lot of different approaches to dealing with the problem. Hence, C is your correct answer. I hope now you're able to figure out the difference. So we say that the grammar does not come in a cat, but yeah, a little bit of the knowledge about anything will not gonna hamper you. Okay. So let's move on to the second question. So the passage provides support for which of the following assertion? So assertion is just a plain statement. Let's see in case if you were able to figure that out. So the passage provides support for which of the following assertions? So the National Park Organic System, the National Park Organic Act gave the Secretary of the Interior the right to overrule state government policies in land adjacent to national parks. Okay, let us see what is the problem here. Okay, it is kind of an out of scope. Now, why it is an out of scope? What does the National Park Organic Act say? So the National Park Organic Act establish the national park system and impart the secretary of the Interior to manage activities within the park. Okay, and it is saying that the National Park Organic Act gave the Secretary of the Interior the right to overrule state government policy in lands adjacent to national parks. Okay, so what is mentioned is that the national park has got the right over the activities which are to the interior to manage activities within the parks. Now, conditions outside park boundaries are not subject to the regulation by the park service. Okay, so how can we say that it has given the right to overrule? Okay, the act only gives right to manage within the park. The part about not to overrule state government policy is not mentioned in the passage. Hence, it is not your answer. Okay, now the federal government has been selling national park land to the state governments in order to raise money for wildlife conservation, where it is even written, not mentioned at all. Okay, so definitely out of scope. The claim is never being done or never being made in the passage. Okay, now the actions of the state government have often failed to promote the interest of the national park wildlife. Okay, now this is a correct answer. So I'm going to come up why this is the correct answer. But first of all, let's negate the option number D and option number E. Now, local politicians want the federal government to turn control of national parks over to the state governments. Now, where it's written here, okay? So, this para 3 actually talks about local politicians was mentioned here. Let me figure out that line. But state legislature, no address of the whether state should protect land and the priorities in this case. Okay, I'm not able to figure out the right line exactly here. But okay, let's see here. Local politicians want the federal government to turn control of national parks over the state governments. So they want the federal government or want a does not mean that they does not want a total control here. Let me just figure out that line first of all. Then it becomes very clear. So because the livelihood of many citizens is linked to the management of local park. Yes, here it is. Okay. So local politicians often encourage. So local politicians often encourage state involvement in federal planning. Okay. And it is saying that local politicians want the federal government to turn control of national parks over to the state governments. They encourage. They often encourage. So often encouraging does not mean that the federal government. So they encourage that the state should be involved whenever the federal is making any sort of planning. But it is saying that local politicians want the federal government to turn control of national parks over to the state government. Okay, so this is too extreme as an answer. Okay, so local politicians wants a greater say in the national park by involving a state into the consideration, but that does not mean that they want total control or turn control of national parks. So extreme. Okay. Now, timber harvesting and energy exploration have not had any impact on national parks. Now, this is a suicide option, okay? It's already written that the timber harvesting, energy exploration compete with wildlife with the local ecosystem, okay? So that is the case. So this cannot be the answer. So by option elimination also, you're left with the option number C as an answer. But let's figure out why C is a better answer. Now, the actions of the state governments have often failed to promote the interest of national park wildlife. So you can say that this is a kind of an inference question. Okay, so you have to see that whatever the things that logically follow from the information within the given passage. Okay, now let's see here para number. Because of the livelihood of many citizens is linked to the management of national parks, local politicians often encourage state involvement in federal planning, but state legislature have not always addressed the fundamental policy issues of whether states should protect wildlife. So they never themselves does not give, okay, we will going to do. They have never taken this responsibility, okay? Timber harvesting, ranching and other priorities among different land uses are generally not established by the current legislation. Additionally, often no mechanisms exist to coordinate planning by the state environmental regulatory agencies. These factors limit the impact of legislation aimed at protecting park wildlife and larger park ecosystem. So the actions of the state government have often failed to promote the interest of national park wildlife. So from these lines, we can still infer that yes, C is the one where the passage will provide support. Okay. Even this paragraph that the state lacks jurisdiction, okay, within the national parks themselves, and the therefore state solutions cannot reach activities inside the park. So all of these give this thing an inference. Like you can something this is that you can, which can be logically follow from the passage. But again, A, B, D, E by the option elimination also does not follow logically from the passage. Hence, C is your answer. Okay. Now, in the context of the passage, the phrase external degradation refers to which of the following? So we need to figure out where is that external degradation was being written. Yeah, it's written here. Okay. So in the context of the passage, the phrase external degradation refers to which of the following? So let's see the external degradation. Now, threats to national parks arising from the House of Representatives willingness to address environmental issues. Now, let's see. Several approaches to protecting the national parks from external degradation have been proposed. Now, external degradation are basically referring to the activities which are happening outside the national park. Okay, so this phrase refers back, you can say, to the damage that is being mentioned in the passage number 1. No, that is activities which are happening outside their boundaries. Okay, now author believes basically that the damage outside boundaries is kind of, you can say, like these were the basically, you can say, no, timber harvesting, ranching, and energy exploration. So these were kind of the activities. So threats to the national park arising from the House of Representative willingness to address environmental issues. So it is not the meaning of the phrase. Okay, it makes no sense. Okay, if the house is willing to address environmental issues, then why park would be threatened? Okay, so it's any house does not make a sense. Okay, now, threats to the national parks arising from state government environmental policies. Indeed, this is the answer. This might give you a little trouble that why it is this the answer, but let's again see. Okay. Now, threats to national park arising from local politicians call for greater state involvement in national park planning. Okay. Now, the interest of the local politicians in park management is mentioned in para number 3. However, there's no sense from this that the politicians are threatening the park. The threats are basically from the some sort of activities that are happening outside their boundaries. Okay. Now, the threats to the national park arising from local politicians calls for greater state involvement. That is not a case. Okay. Rather, to solve this particular external degradation, the local politicians are saying that you should encourage state involvement. Okay. So whenever they are planning to look after these external degradation, the state should be involved. But are the threats arising from the local politicians' calls? We cannot say that. Okay. Now, threats to national park arising from the National Park Organic Act. Now, this is not the case. Okay. The National Organic Park is basically to impart the national park system and impart the secretary to manage the interior of the activities within the park. Okay. But how come the external degradation is referring to the activities which are happening outside their boundaries? So this act does not govern to the outside anything. So it cannot be a threat. Okay. So it is an out of scope. Okay. Now, threats to national parks arising from the lack of local support. Now, lack of local support basically comes in a last paragraph, and it is clearly not what author implies when the author says external degradation. Okay, rather he said that to solve this external degradation, the local participation should be taken into consideration. Right now, we are left with the option number B here. Now, threats to national park arising from state government environmental policies. Okay, the author believes that in case if you know that the damage outside park boundaries is because of negligence of the state governments. Okay, as it is being argued in para number 3 and 4. Okay, so in case, let me just do this thing again, an inference based question, not a very easy one, but let's see. Okay, so they are saying that okay, legislation addressing external park this, but House of Representative but died without action in Senate. Okay, so also brought to the table as possibly remedies giving the states bordering the parks a significant and meaningful role in developing. But state legislature have not always addressed the fundamental issues of whether states should protect wildlife. Okay, so within the local ecosystem, priorities among different land uses are generally not established. Additionally, no mechanism exists to coordinate planning by the state environmental regulatory agency. So no doubt that there is some sort of a gap in the option. Okay, but still, out of in case if everything, if we say, so we can say that the author is not pretty happy with whatever the state and how the state is basically handling the activities which are governing outside the national park. Okay, so in that context of the passage, the phrase external degradation refers to the threats of national park arising from state government environmental policies, because this is within this is controlled by the central government. Okay, outside that is governed by the state government basically. Okay, so not by the central government. So it's assumed that it is being controlled by the state government. So since they are not taking steps, they are not interested, they're not participating, they're not taking the responsibility. So we can say that the external degradation may refer to the threats to the national park which are arising from state government environmental policies. Okay, but again, there is a kind of, this is not the perfect answer, but yes, out of all these options, this is the better answer, I would say. Okay, so sometimes in case of the CAT, because in case of your paper, in case of RC especially, you don't have the perfect answers. Okay, but sometimes you have the better answer, which is better than comparison to any other thing for that matter, right? Now the last question of this paragraph passage, according to the passage, which of the following developments is most likely if environmental cooperation between the federal government and state government does not improve? Okay, so according to the passage, which of the following developments is most likely if environmental cooperation between the federal government and state government does not improve? Okay, to start this questions, okay, you look to go within the passage, like what is the scenario in the question mentioned? Okay, so go to the last paragraph, which discusses that the residents of the state bordering national parks are affected by the park management policy. They in turn affect the success of those policy. So this interrelationship must be considered in responding to the external threats problem. Local participation is necessary in deciding how to protect park wildlife. Local interests should not, however, dictate national policy, nor should they be used as a pretext to ignore the threats to the park region. Okay, so basically, what I would recommend in that case is that, okay, let's go by the option and then we're going to figure out the answer to this. So according to the passage, which of the following development is most likely if environmental cooperation between the federal government and the state government does not approve? Okay, so in case if there's no cooperation or nothing that is happening between them, okay, then what can be done? Okay, so if this cooperation does not occur, okay, so a further decline in the land area of national parks. Now, this is not the answer. The author never mentions like there will be any decline in the land area of national parks. So will the area will going to be reduced or shrink? Okay, this is not. They are saying that whatever the area that we have, there will be a lot of danger to the existing land. Okay, but it will gonna be declining in the land area. It's out of scope, I would say. Okay, now a further increase in federal ownership of land adjacent to national parks. Now, the author argues that the federal government already owns most of the land around national park and does not suggest anywhere that it will own more without cooperation. Okay, so they say that a further increase in federal ownership of land adjacent to the national parks. Now, it is not possible, okay, because as per this, the National Park Organic Act, they have the control over interior of the park area. Okay, but again, the entire debate over writing this particular passage is to what is happening outside and who will going to control it. Okay, in case if it was that easy, that in case if there is no tie-up and the federal government takes it, then there was no point of indeed writing the passage, right? So this cannot be the case, okay? Because in case if this cannot be done, then why do we need all this passage for, all this discussion for? Okay, so further increase in federal ownership of land adjacent to the national parks. Again, no, okay, not possible right now, but maybe keep on hold. Let's see. A further growth in the power of the National Park Service. Okay, so the author never makes this argument in the passage. Or what is this National Park Service? So it is the National Park Organic Act, okay, subject to the regulation by the Park Service unless they involve the direct use of park resources. So it is governing to inside, but the further growth in the powers of the National Park Service, maybe it's BNC in almost same for that matter. A further loss of species in national park. Now, this is a possible case, okay? Now, why this is a possible case is that because if there is no sort of see what the author actually gives the suggestion. So author gives a solution that it should be a combination of a national, okay, as well as the state government and the local participation. So all of them should be incorporated in that. Okay, so it argues that the cooperation is necessary in order to protect park wildlife. Okay, so if this cooperation does not occur, okay, then what is the case? Then the external threat will going to increase. Okay, so by many of the national parks are adversely affected by activities outside their boundaries. So when the activities outside the boundaries are increasing, so what can be the result of that? That there will be a further loss of species in national parks. Okay, now a further increase in the timber harvesting activities. Now this is also one possible option that might have trouble you, but this is too specific. Okay, there is no direct connection between environmental cooperation and timber harvesting activities. Okay, so it is just saying here that the timber harvesting, ranching, and energy exploration compete with wildlife within the local ecosystem. So they compete. Okay, so in case if there is no cord that is being struck between the state and the central government or the federal government, then what could happen? There will be an increase in timber harvesting activities. No, that is not the case. Okay, what will be the ultimate? What will be the result? Okay, so in case if there is an increase in a timber harvesting activity, what would be the repercussions? The repercussions again would be the loss of a species in national parks. Okay, so that is the case. Now, a further increase in federal ownership. Now, this cannot be possible because then again the Senate needs to give you the note for it. Okay, so when they are not striking, so the Senate will give the note to it. So we don't know that whether that particular act will be able to take into the charge the activities which are happening outside the boundaries. This is all assumptions, very far-fetched assumption. But yes, the one thing that is sure that will gonna happen in case if there is no link between the central and the state government is that there will be a lot of external threats. Okay, and what those external threats will gonna do, they're gonna compete with wildlife within the local ecosystem. So when they're competing with wildlife within the ecosystem, the loss is there for the species. So that is the case that the D is the correct answer. Okay, so by this we are done with this RC 99 para number 1. In case if you still have any queries, feel free to ping us. We'll be more than happy to help you. So I hope you had some learning. So happy learning. Enjoy your day. Stay safe. Take care.